and even the election.
Right.
That's what she did. I mean, I think
usually
at
it's
that
like
point,
way
The Return of the Free is a monumental.
well, we were in Control Z, right? And then I don't even think that was it that had been named the
really?
official candidate when that came out. So that's how out of date it
Right.
was.
Exciting news.
All right, I think I'm ready.
I was leaving work, grabbed my laptop, I shut it, I unplug it,
Good enough.
and somehow it never made it into the bag.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your patience while we get everything keyed up here. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute. I know many of you. If I don't, please come and say hi afterwards because I'd like to make new friends. I'm a friendly guy. I am delighted to be here. It's thrilling to actually be here at the launch of our latest book, a project which has taken more than 2 years to produce. And as any of you who have been involved in a book project know, it's rather like giving birth, equally painful, but everybody should be congratulated and receive a cigar afterwards. And the first congratulations I'm going to make are actually to the young woman beside me, Alison, who continues to work on this project, Alison Cordell. Alison has really been the backbone of this effort. She pulled everything together at some of the most difficult times. She pushed myself and David when we didn't answer emails. She would call us at midnight, it was a little bit creepy, to get us to actually fulfill our obligations on this book. And so I would actually like to offer a round of applause to Alison Cordell. Thank you. At some point in the near future, Alison's going to be leaving us to go and pursue bigger and better things. I'm very sad about that, but we will miss you when you're gone, Ali, but don't leave just yet, okay? Let me just say a little bit about this book before I turn it over to David Shirk, who is one of the editors of this project as well. The concept of resilient communities is one which has been discussed extensively in Mexico in recent years. As David will say, it's been an element of Pillar 4 of the Merida Initiative, but also more recently, the Mexican government has undertaken a major project to focus on the question of rebuilding the fabric of society. The concepts of crime prevention and violence reduction feature very prominently in Mexican security policy at this point in time. And so the timing of this book, I think, is incredibly positive. We have an opportunity, I think, right now in Mexico and, of course, in U.S. government interactions with the Mexican government to tell a story and to offer concrete proposals on how to build community resilience in Mexico as a direct counterpart to other strategies for fighting public insecurity, organized crime. We have a book which is full of a number of different chapters. We're telling different stories. There is a conceptual element here. And as I say, we get through to concrete policy proposals by the end. I am not going to give a summary of any of the chapters that are in here, nor of the conclusions of the book. I'm going to leave that to my colleagues. We're very, very happy to have so many of the book's authors here with us today. And so for that reason, we don't actually have a great deal of time per person. So I am going to shut down my comments right now and turn it over to David Shirk, who will give us a proper introduction to this book. Many thanks for your attention.
Great. Thanks, Duncan. I'm going to put, let's put that one we just had on. Like,
You want the
presentation? The next presentation.
Yeah, absolutely.
While Duncan's pulling that up, I'll just say, first of all, I'm David Shirk. I'm a professor at the University of San Diego's Department of Political Science and International Relations. I'm also very fortunate to be a global fellow here at the Wilson Center, working directly with the Mexico Institute, and have been working on this project for the last 2 years, along with Duncan, Eric Olson. We were also involved early on, Andrew Seeley. And it's really a pleasure to see it come to fruition. I simply want to echo Duncan's comments about how important Allison's role has been, how incredibly wonderful she's been in coordinating and cajoling us to move forward with this initiative. I want to start out simply by emphasizing that in many ways, oh, wow. Thank you. This is a continuation of work that we started a few years ago, a book and a project focused on the Merida Initiative called Shared Responsibility. It was a project that attempted to break down and better understand the various components of the Merida Initiative at a time when it was just getting up and running and being implemented. And of course, as we were doing this, one of the key aspects of the Merida Initiative was just formally being introduced at the time. Let me see if this works. At a time when, this was 2009, 2010, when the problem of crime and violence, the problems of crime and violence in Mexico were really beginning to rise. They had not yet reached their apex in 2011. Here what you're looking at are various measures of violence, different homicide statistics, whether they look at regular homicides or specifically organized crime, OGC-style homicides. But what you can see is that we kind of reached a peak in 2011, but there was this accelerating sense of things getting more and more out of control in the lead up and in the early years of the Merida Initiative. That sensation was exacerbated not just by rising problems of homicide, which at least half of which was concentrated among people involved in organized crime or related in some way, however tangentially to organized crime activities. But over time, we've seen more and more ordinary people targeted by kidnapping, moving on, extortion, and this sensation that violence was in some ways democratizing, some ways becoming more prevalent throughout society, was part of the urgency for thinking about ways of improving citizen security and figuring out how best to engage communities in the fight against organized crime. The counter-drug strategies of Vicente Fox and Felipe Calderon emphasized various stateside initiatives to improve the rule of law in Mexico. One of the things that was a particular innovation of the Calderon administration was much closer cooperation with the United States through the Merida Initiative. The Merida Initiative had, in the initial phase, sort of three main elements: combating organized crime, judicial sector reform, building a 21st century border. All of these, again, either government-driven or government-to-government initiatives. And what's interesting and unique about the idea of Pillar 4, the idea of promoting resilient communities, the idea of targeting some of the most affected areas, most affected localities by violence, is that it brought in another dimension, which is not state to state, but state to society relations in trying to address the problem. The question is, what constitutes a resilient community? And for us, as we were researching the shared responsibility project, we had the really incredible experience and fortuitous timing to be present in having prepared a whole series of week-long research activities with our group in Ciudad Juarez, the very day after the massacre in Colonia Salvarcar of 13 young children and 2 adults who were evidently innocently targeted by organized crime groups in a case of mistaken identity. And that incident became a focal point for many people nationally and internationally on what was wrong, what was going wrong in Mexico at the time, and the terrible effects that this wave of violence was having on Mexico's communities. For us, visiting Juarez at that particular moment, when we could see that the people were so incredibly frustrated and distrustful of the authorities, and even the authorities themselves really didn't have a grasp or an understanding of what to do, particularly in trying to work with civil society. They tended to see reporters and local communities and victims groups as complaining and not bringing forward positive ideas, pointing fingers, and so on. This problem of trust raised a lot of questions about how do you promote resilience? What is a resilient community? This book, in many ways, is the answer to those questions. Our efforts to bring together some of the folks that some of whom worked on the original project, some who brought some new things to the table, to try to understand the concept of what a resilient community is, how you promote resilience in many cases when you're in your darkest hour, and to try to find successful case studies and successful examples of strengthening civil society, enabling civil society to work with government actors and try to overcome problems of crime and violence. The first question we asked was, what is resilience? And we talk about strong communities, or we talk about strength, and strength is the capacity to either exert or resist force. But it is not necessarily the capacity to repair. I mean, a rock is strong, it's hard, but if you break a rock, it's broken. It doesn't repair itself. And the concept of resilience started to come into sort of the academic literature in the 1970s with the study of ecological systems and biosystems, and the way that ecosystems essentially in some ecosystems have the capacity to manage trauma, manage scarcity in ways that are constructive and enable the biosystem to reconfigure itself and adapt and thrive in many cases. And this is what we were really looking for in trying to identify strategies of promoting community resilience. In other words, what is it? It's not just enough to have a certain degree of strength or certain ties. There are many different elements that we looked at in the various literatures. Flexibility, a certain degree of diversity within a community where you can essentially borrow from different strengths and capacities of different groups or individuals, a capacity to actually recognize and identify threats and respond to them, et cetera. Ultimately, what we try to do throughout the chapters and in the book as a whole is identify what are some of the things that have that offer guidelines and recommendations and some best practices for policymakers and even for communities themselves. The first of 3 sort of big picture points I think that comes out of this is the idea that we need to recognize that you can't just focus on stronger states and strengthening state institutions without focusing on society. And to the extent that we're talking about Pillar 4 issues, we're talking about civil society, civil society needs to have an effective partner in the state. If you look at what's happening right now in Michoacan, for example, vigilantism, self-defense groups. In many ways, it's a reflection of the fact that the state is not an effective partner for civil society, and so they've had to go it alone, take the law into their own hands. And even if you have reasonably some degree of capacity in state and society, you've got to build trust between the two. The examples I gave in Ciudad Juarez of distrust, I think, underscore this point. If there's not a sense that you're working together towards a common goal, and if there's not if there's not the information, the communication, et cetera, to enable state and society to work together, you will have a much more difficult time trying to resolve problems. And the last is figuring out how outsiders can play a constructive role in situations where maybe that trust and confidence has eroded or never existed, or where state and or society is weak. And here what we saw, for example, in the aftermath of the Colinas Albarcar massacre, a very important role for federal authorities, for example, in Mexico, to step in and help resolve some of those problems. Coming to Chihuahua, coming to Ciudad Juarez, and creating spaces for dialogue, creating opportunities for people to sort of bring their grievances and concerns together and talk around the table and work through those. But also a role for international organizations, for the U.S. ambassador and others to sort of continue to help mediate and cajole and push that process forward. And of course, that kind of effort doesn't necessarily lead to an immediate reduction in crime and violence. We have seen a dramatic decrease in crime and violence in Ciudad Juarez over the last 2 years particularly. But to me, what's especially useful about the role of civic engagement is in the aftermath of that kind of crime and violence. You begin to have the elements and capacity to repair a lot of the damage. I mean, once a society, a community, an individual has experienced a serious trauma like this, family members who've been lost, communities that have had neighbors just pick up and leave and move to El Paso, you've got to figure out, sort of in the aftermath of violence, even after the violence is long gone, what you're going to do to sort of reweave the social fabric. And that's what many of these chapters do, I think, in very concrete ways, is identify specific, first of all, examples and best practices on the ground, but also concrete policy recommendations in several different areas. So I'm going to actually let each of the authors talk a little bit about some of their findings and move through the panel discussion, and that will hopefully leave enough time for questions and answers. But we'll start with Matt and just move down the table. Go ahead. Oh, yeah, I don't know if this works, but...
If not, I've got my finger right here.
Okay.
He's really good at it.
Well, thank you, David. I'd also like to thank the Wilson Center and the Mexico Institute, and specifically Duncan, David, Andrew, Seeley, Eric Olson for their editing, direction, guidance on this project and in my contribution to it. Can you go to the next slide? Forecasting or looking ahead, I'm just going to cover quickly what I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you it. So then hopefully it'll make more sense. If I've done my job well over the course of the next 10 or 11 minutes, this will make this first slide, when you see it again in about 9 or 10 minutes, will make more sense. But essentially my key conclusions here are, one, that violence has a spatial component in Mexico. That is that violence, specifically homicide, is not geographically random. It clusters in predictable ways, or it clusters in patterns. Second, violence in one municipality affects violence in other municipalities. That is, it spreads, it transfers, it spills over from one community to another. Third, education has a protective effect against violence. The more a community reaches higher levels of education, the more it protects itself from future patterns of violence. And lastly, that economic development has a regionally protective effect. That is, that we should not be so concerned about economic development in local, isolated, individual communities, because what appears to be happening empirically is that crime is committed in municipalities that are surrounded by other communities that have depressed economies. So that is, individuals in outlying depressed areas commit crimes in local, more affluent areas. So this is essentially one way of thinking about the puzzle, the problem, the question that all of us were tackling here in this volume. Is this map graphically represents the spatial variation in violence, again measured as homicide rates in the year 2010. It's just a single cross-section of data. But you can see there's a dramatic, important, meaningful spatial variation subnationally in violence across Mexico's nearly 2,500 municipalities. Even a casual glance at a map like this sort of draws your attention to certain geographic regions in Mexico, maybe the Northwest, maybe the Northeast, maybe some communities around southern or central Mexico. But essentially, we're concerned about what explains this variation, right? Why? Why does this variation take place? And I'm going to move through the content of my contribution to this volume in four sort of distinct movements, or at least I'll tell you briefly about them and let you read about them in your own time. But the first move that I make is a conceptual clarification, sort of complementing what David Shirk, Eric Olson, and Duncan Wood do in the opening chapter. They also clarify what we mean by resilience, community resilience, and especially what we mean by community resilience to violence. There's a long literature on related concepts like social capital, collective efficacy in disciplines like sociology, criminology. Collective efficacy in those literatures is widely understood as task-specific. That means that resilience to one phenomenon or form of adversity or trauma, as David said, does not translate to resilience to other forms of adversity. So adversity to an economic crisis or some kind of psychological trauma does not necessarily translate to financial resilience, say, or to resilience to a wave of violence in your community. So we want to be thinking fairly concretely about resilience as being task-specific to waves of crime and violence. So in the first portion of the chapter, I clarify what that might look like, how we might know community resilience to violence when we see it. From that discussion, I move into identifying some working hypotheses or explanations. This is essentially the conceptual map of community resilience. Each one of these components of community resilience identifies a component or a potential measure or proxy that we might identify out in the world that we could obtain from existing data sources. And I then move through and obtain measures for each of these components. So for population pressures or population density or educational attainment or economic development, economic inactivity, inequality, participation in communities. And I take all of these measures here listed again and tie them to existing sort of hypotheses or explanations about causes of violence. In the statistical analysis, I work through examining how each of these potential components of community resilience explains variation in homicide rates in 2010 in Mexico. And the analysis, the empirical analysis, takes place in two stages. The first stage tries to identify whether violence is indeed spatially random. Right? So this speaks to my first conclusion that I forecasted earlier. Is violence spatially random. And the clear finding is that it's not. Perhaps most emphatically, the red municipalities, the red color, identifies those municipalities that are the cores of statistically significant clusters of municipalities of high homicide rates. So importantly, each one of these colored municipalities is the core of a cluster. It includes the blank surrounding municipalities, so that the actual cluster of high homicide is much larger than the individual red colored municipalities. The blue clusters are also interesting because they're statistically significant cores of low levels of homicide rates. But let's just stick to the higher homicide rates for the time being. In the chapter, I detail 3 of these clusters. I've identified them here numerically, 1, 2, and 3. These are important because they straddle the boundaries or the borders of at least 3 states. So up in the upper left, you can see a cluster that straddles the borders of Sonora, Chihuahua, Sinaloa, and Durango. In the northeast, you can see a cluster of homicide that straddles the borders of Tamaulipas, Coahuila, and Nuevo León. And in the central part of Mexico, you could see a cluster of violence that straddles the borders of Jalisco, Nayarit, and Zacatecas. So again, speaking to the first conclusion, violence is not geographically random. I then undergo a more extensive statistical analysis, and I think the primary contribution here is that I'm explicitly accounting for the fact that the data in one municipality is connected to the data in adjoining municipalities. So what you see in a lot of other statistical analyses of similar phenomenon is that municipality A is treated as if it's independently distributed from all other 2,500 municipalities in Mexico. And we know that's explicitly not true, right? Municipality A is surrounded by municipalities B, C, D, and E, and what's happening in those municipalities, if municipality A is surrounded by communities with high levels of violence, that's likely having an effect on violence in the focal municipality. And similarly, as I forecasted earlier, if municipality A is surrounded by economically depressed communities, municipality is likely to experience higher levels of violence. So we have tools that allow us to analyze this, right? Statistical tools that allow us to analyze this. Geographers, demographers, epidemiologists have used these tools, and I'm just applying them here to the study of patterns of crime. There are several findings outlined in the paper, and some of the details on the data and the methods are outlined in an earlier paper published by the Mexico Institute in January. But I'm just going to highlight 2 of those findings here. One is that economic inactivity, sort of circled here below, has a negative effect on violence locally within a municipality. So think of your sort of typical municipality A or hypothetical municipality A. If there are high levels of unemployment in municipality A, violence drops. This might seem counterintuitive at first, but there are similar findings in the US criminology literature, and basically the idea there is that depressed economies locally might provide fewer targets for crime because there's less people moving around, people are less affluent. However, the more dominant finding is that economic inactivity, think of this perhaps simply as unemployment, in outlying areas generates higher levels of violence locally. And this is the stronger finding both in terms of statistical significance and magnitude. So it overwhelms this local relationship. Essentially, the conclusion here is that unemployment and other forms of economic inactivity in your neighborhood of communities increases violence in your own community. The second finding I'm going to highlight here is that education has a protective effect, and this is only a local effect. There is no neighborhood effect for education. This has clear policy implications, which I'll get to in just a second. So again, the conclusions, which I forecasted earlier, and again, if I've done my job well, hopefully this slide makes a little bit more sense than it did 9 or 10 minutes ago. But violence is not geographically random in Mexico. Violence in community A affects violence in community B, that is, violence in your neighboring communities affects violence in your community. So if as a community, as a government, as elected officials, you should be concerned not just about violence in your home community, but about violence in your surrounding communities. Education has a local protective effect. Economic development has a regional protective effect. So what are the concrete policy implications? And I'll just finish here, briefly outlining some very concrete ways in which policymakers might think about these findings. I summarize the findings as a kind of local schools, regional economy approach to violence reduction. This also helps us think about what resilient communities might look like, right? How do we know community resilience to violence when we see it? We know it because they are communities with very strong educational attainment, embedded within, nested within regions that are also economically prosperous or economically prospering. So this leads to the two concrete policy implications, which is that education policies can be targeted very locally, even to isolated individual communities, but economic development policies must be targeted at regionally relevant groups or clusters of municipalities. Most importantly, economic development policies must be targeted at relevantly connected groups or clusters of municipalities, even if they straddle more than one state boundary or higher jurisdictional boundary. So these findings and policy implications provide some ways of thinking about how the federal government or state government might incentivize local governments to experiment in different ways, perhaps providing funding, recognition, prizes to local governments or projects that specifically improve educational policies locally, economic policies regionally, and collaboration across jurisdictional boundaries. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Matt. Next, we'll hear from Emily Edmonds-Poley, who is a colleague of mine at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of San Diego.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to have been invited to contribute to this volume, which I think is really fantastic, and some of the first work, I think, that really sort of takes on this issue of resilient communities in Mexico. My chapter focuses on the effects of drug war-related violence on journalists and media workers. And the idea of the chapter was sort of to give an overview of sort of the scope of the problem and then explore some of the responses both from the state but primarily societal level to addressing this problem. And so the first thing that I wanted to say, and I'm realizing these are out of order, but is that if looking at this again, I guess a little bit spatially, there's what we see is that the number of journalists that have been targeted by drug-related violence tend to be clustered in specific areas that not coincidentally are the same areas where you see the most drug-related homicides in general. And so you'll see the darker, the problem with this map, of course, is there's so many municipalities in Mexico that some of them are very small, and it makes it's sometimes hard to see. For example, in Veracruz, there are 11 murders on this map, but it looks it's sort of tiny on this map, but that's one of the areas where there have been actually the most murders, right? So we have this kind of geographic distribution where, in fact, in number terms, most of them have been concentrated in the north, but those deaths also coincided with with those particular places being hotspots of the drug war at the time. Veracruz is a little bit more of a recent development. But to give you a broader sort of idea of sort of who's being killed, been 110 victims since 2000, which, 110 people, when you talk about, 70,000 plus killed in the Calderon administration alone, it doesn't seem like perhaps a particularly large number, but I would argue that the impact of their deaths is exponentially greater than the number makes it seem, for reasons that we'll talk about in a second. But just a very quick profile, most of them clearly, vast majority are male. Vast majority happen to cover crime and corruption for print media outlets rather than television or radio. A maybe a handful, I think, have been killed sort of in the line of duty because they, in some aspect that maybe was not or possibly not related to drug violence. But in most others, the suspected perpetrator is either an organized criminal group or the local and state government, who often have ties to organized criminal groups. The consequences of this, I don't know that I need to go into great detail about, but obviously, contributes to the larger sense of public insecurity in Mexico. But on a broader sort of macro level, really limits the availability of information and threatens freedom of expression, which has much more serious implications for the health of Mexico's democracy. In many senses, but I think one of these is that citizens without access to information can neither punish nor reward their elected officials for their behavior in office. So this sort of connection between constituents and their elected officials is broken. There have been a number of Mexican state responses, really beginning with the Fox administration in 2006. In general, I think we can say that the Mexican state has been rather slow to respond, and the measures that it has introduced have been had only a very mild effect, if we could perhaps call it that. There was, for example, the creation of a special prosecutor within the Attorney General's office. This was done by President Fox essentially just before he left office. But there were problems with sort of the lack of clarity with jurisdiction, the lack of permanence of the position, a number of other problems that have prevented this particular office from being very effective. We can go into some of these details if you want later during the Q&A, but just to continue on, there are also some new legal protections. For example, a law that specifically is designed to protect journalists and others, and sort of almost like a double guarantee, if you will, of freedom of expression, which is part of the Mexican Constitution. But this law tries to really codify that people cannot be targeted for expressing sort of unpopular, I guess, opinions. There's also the what's called the protection mechanism, which is an agency within the government that has been specifically created to create a standardized protocol for providing security and protection to journalists and others who believe themselves to have been to be in danger as a result of their profession. This is, in theory, certainly a step in the right direction. The way that the protocol works, however, is that there are a claim is made by the journalist or member of an NGO or someone who feels threatened. There's a 3-hour sort of evaluation period and then a 9-hour period within which the government is given, I suppose, to protect that person. Right, so there's basically a 12-hour window that the government has to act, which again, in theory, seems reasonable. But the fact of the matter is that violence is unpredictable. If someone is truly interested in targeting an individual, 12 hours can often be too long. So this is what's happened at the federal level. There are no comparable measures at the state and local level, which is very problematic for two reasons. One is that for all of the change that's happened at the federal level, there's nothing that requires state and local governments to cooperate with federal officials. And state and local governments are often the ones that have jurisdiction over the crimes because that's where the crimes occur. And so that's one problem. The other problem is that it is sometimes the state and local officials who are implicated, complicit, some in other ways sort of connected to the crimes that are actually being committed. So there's this huge conflict of interest. In terms of sort of general government responses, we can see that they've really fallen short. And this, brings us to sort of the topic of the day of resilient communities. How has the Mexican society responded? And if you sort of break down civil society into these different groups that have a stake in this, we can see that journalists have been the first, perhaps, to, not surprisingly, to respond in a variety of different ways. Some, generally very informal. We have seen two in the last, I guess, 3 or 4 years. We've seen two marches, public marches that were organized by journalists to call attention to the problem. But that so far, beyond sort of being a visible kind of trying to bring greater visibility to the issue, have not really resulted in any kind of concrete improvements. The media owners are a bit of a mixed bag. Some of them have gone to great lengths to protect their employees by doing basic things like reinforcing buildings with bulletproof glass and providing satellite phones and things of this sort that can help journalists do their jobs in a safer environment. Others have done nothing, and have even go so far as to encourage journalists to, essentially either take bribes from drug trafficking organizations, to freelancing, hiring freelancers to cover the most dangerous jobs, so that they don't have any sort of real strong employer ties, right, that would bring greater responsibility onto them. The bulk of the work and the most exciting work and sort of encouraging work that's been done in Mexican society has really been done on the part of Mexican NGOs, sometimes in partnership with international NGOs. So there'll be sort of the Mexican chapter of, say, Article 19, or the Committee to Protect Journalists. And they've really been very active, both at calling attention to the problem and also at trying to present very concrete policy solutions to the government as a constructive way to address the problem. Article 19, for example, and Periodistas de a Pie have both been really very instrumental in trying to sort of push this agenda forward, but have not had, to date, clearly, given the kind of unsatisfactory nature of the state's response, obviously can't claim total victory. Finally, the citizen journalists. What has happened as a practical effect of all of these sorts of journalists' murders is that there are many journalists and editors and even media owners who self-censor. They just stop reporting. And what that has meant geographically is that there are some areas that suffer from information blackouts. There is, you look at Tamaulipas, for example, there's very little that we know, and that even Mexico, sort of is known about what's going on there on a daily basis. What's happened is that some citizens have stepped in to fill that void by creating blogs, using their Twitter accounts, posting information about what part of town is there's a gunfight going on, stay out of this part of town, or publishing information about sort of how many people were killed in the last gunfight, this type of thing. Which, on the one hand, in thinking very much about this idea of resilience, right? That here is a community, of people who have stepped forward under very dangerous, very threatening conditions to perform this role. The downside, because this is, of course, a very mixed bag, is that many of these people, these citizen journalists, have themselves been targeted. And so some of the murders that are included in those figures are, in fact, citizen journalists who have, were murdered and left with a note that says, this is what I get for asking too many questions, and, things of this sort. How much time do I have?
About a minute or two.
Okay, yeah, I'll skip that part. Going on to the policy recommendations, there are a few here for the Mexican government, but I want to sort of focus on the ones that are related more to society. The bottom line for the government is that it has to end, in order for this problem to be resolved, the impunity has to go away, right? At this point, there are really, the fact that there are no measures that are effectively used to punish the murderers of journalists, or anyone else, I guess, for that matter, creates sort of a condoning effect, right? That there's no message being sent that this is a problematic issue. But in the face of that, then that journalists, there are all these different groups really have to work together to try to, number one, keep the issue very visible. Both within Mexico and internationally. Mexico is the most dangerous country in the Western Hemisphere for journalists. And that is not a reputation that the Peña Nieto administration or any other wants to have. But the only way that it can really become salient is if people keep talking about it. And so that's one of the things that the NGOs have done really very well. But there's certainly more to be done, and I think there are some creative ways, some lessons that we can take from places like Colombia and others where media outlets can work together to publicize information and at the same time decrease the risk to their employees. The basic things are, publishing articles without bylines, having reporters switch beats, having a story about whatever Reynosa published in Mexico City to sort of decrease the lines of contact. And I think that this would also carry over well across international borders, right? For U.S. media outlets to carry these stories as well, that where you can have a much wider reach. And so this is a perfect case where it's going to be very difficult for Mexican civil society to solve the problem on its own, right? The pressure has to come on the government, has to come from below, from society, but it also has to come from the outside, right? From the international community. And I'll leave it there.
Great. We'll go now directly to Steve Dudley, co-director of Insight Crime, former Wilson Fellow.
Hi, is this working? Hi, everyone. Thanks, David, Duncan, Chris Wilson, Eric Olson, Andrew Seeley, Wilson Center. Been a good experience. This, as was noted, is a couple years ago since we started this project. So a quick disclaimer, we did most of our research in late 2012. What we tried to note anyway in our research was major tendencies and perhaps push forward a little bit, but some of the information we have might be a little outdated. Maybe we could even bring up some of the information that, I don't know if you have access to the internet?
Yeah. I don't know. Let me see. Okay.
All right. Anyway, if we go to Como Vamos NL, might be interesting to have a look at while I'm speaking. I actually don't have a slideshow. And I'll just speak in general terms about what we did. When I say we, it's because I worked with Sandra Rodriguez, who's an award-winning journalist based in Juarez, Mexico. She's currently up at Harvard doing a Nieman fellowship, but she was invaluable and actually did most of the research for this on the ground. We had the task of looking at 4 cities, Monterrey, Ciudad Juarez, Tijuana, and Nuevo Laredo, and trying to gauge how civil society had reacted to the violence and then intersected with local security officials to deal with the issues they were facing. As you guys already know, these areas would be considered border towns. This kind of shapes their commerce, of course. It also shapes their criminal organizations. It even shapes, the way in which they operate and the way in which they've evolved over the years. I'm not going to go into too much detail about why these things happened, but I will say, obviously, that these areas became some of the most violent. They became incredibly unlivable in some instances, certainly in the case of Ciudad Juarez, where you had massive numbers of people vacating entire neighborhoods due to things mostly related to kidnapping, extortion, but other situations as well, including great numbers of homicides. The civil society groups that emerged to face these issues were a mix of different types of groups. They were professional organizations, they were business associations, and they reacted in different ways to this violence. In some cases, I would say, such as Ciudad Juarez and Tijuana and Monterrey, they organized fairly well to push local, state, and federal government to meet with them regularly, to share information with them, and to even implement some schemes with them. These efforts in those areas were led by doctors and lawyers, academics, human rights advocates, church workers, and businessmen. But they had varying rates of success. Much depended on their interactions with the federal government and their direct interaction with the federal government. And this also depended on often their personal connections to those members of the federal government, which obviously not all of them had. This also made these pushes less than institutional. They became much more about the personal relationship rather than creating institutional relationships between these civil society groups and the federal government, unfortunately. In the other case that we looked at, Nuevo Laredo, we saw no activity whatsoever. It was a case in which you saw civil society really had almost, the groups had almost disintegrated. They had moved into these sort of shells, and they couldn't face what was out there, because what was out there was arguably the most dangerous threat that faced any of these organizations, with the Zetas organization, which had run Nuevo Laredo for all intents and purposes pretty much beginning around 2004. Just one example was the police chief, who was also a former businessman. His name was Alejandro Dominguez Coello. He was also a former businessman and a member of the Chamber of Commerce, who decided he was going to become the head of security in 2005. So here you have a situation whereby somebody from civil society moving into government, so we actually have this link coming to life, and 8 hours after he took the job, he was killed. So this is the message that they get over and over in Nuevo Laredo, and to be expected, they then move indoors, so to say, and they stop doing these interactions, they stop talking about things like security, and it has a really, really bad effect. In sum, I could say that these efforts are in their nascent stages for a lot of different reasons in Mexico as well. Probably the foremost reason is the old political structures, the pre-party itself. The idea that you would have independent civil society organizations that would be able to develop independent strength and independent even political bases and independent financial revenue streams was not something that was a tradition in Mexico before really the sort of their sort of hegemony, their powerful control over all the levers of power had dissipated, let's say. Basically, everything was channeled through those levers of power. So now, all of a sudden, you have different types of organizations that are emerging that are very young. And they're having to face these incredibly difficult challenges, not having the access that perhaps they need to face these different kinds of challenges. There are a number of other impediments, I would say, to the civil society's interaction with security forces and their development of these strong, resilient communities or relationships. And the number one, of course, is the one we all know, which is fear. This is something that goes beyond just being afraid of a criminal organization. You can be very sensitive that if you're a business association of criminals disrupting your revenue streams. Obviously, you can be afraid of what can happen to your employees if you take a certain stance. You can be afraid of what might happen to your family members. There are a number of extensions of fear that go beyond the fact that I might be fearful that something might happen to me. There's also fear of the authorities themselves. This has been alluded to, talked about in general terms, the idea of impunity. But impunity is one side of it. The other side of it is actual participation or collaboration of the security forces, judicial forces, others within the Mexican government with these criminal organizations. So if you are a member of civil society, who is the trustworthy interlocutor? And this is a major question, and especially in areas such as Nuevo Laredo, where there are none. The second thing I would say, and I alluded to it earlier, has to do with politics in terms of impediments to civil society interactions with these security forces. Politics, talking more about this notion of kind of working across the aisle. Of course, you know, in Washington we can hardly talk about working across the aisle, but there is also not that much of a tradition of working across the aisle. And then when things change in these areas, it's very difficult to keep the progress of previous efforts going. And the example we found, or I would just bring up here really quickly, is the idea of Crime Stoppers. They started this in motion in Juarez. They changed administrations in the municipality, and the new mayor said, you know what, we're not doing that. And so you have this as an impediment as well. The third impediment to this process is the idea of Mexico as a federalist system, this idea that you have these different sets of powers that you have to deal with. And as I alluded to earlier, the way in which most of these civil society organizations got any traction on anything they did was when they had personal connections to someone on the federal level. You know, often this was facilitated by their connections on the municipal level, but when things really happened, it's when they had connections on the federal level. The last thing I would mention in terms of impediments are competing interests that these civil society groups often have when they try to come together. I'll again bring up Juarez, and the example that was really coming to the fore when I was there, and it led to some pretty heated debates within the different civil society organizations that were interacting with the government, had to do with the mass roundups that the police were doing of youth, which they suspected of being criminals or being involved in criminal activity. This was, to some extent, pretty popular on the business side of things. And in a way, it has, in effect, a sort of deterrent effect. It disrupts a lot of things that can happen to criminal groups. It disrupts their sort of normal rhythm and flow of criminal groups. So the business groups kind of liked this. They thought that this was having an impact. But obviously, the human rights groups who were working with the business groups didn't like this at all. So they had completely, they were at odds in terms of what their goals were in that particular instance. Just a few sorts of things about what works, which I think is probably the essence of where we want to go, or at least what we saw worked when we looked at these 4 different cities. The first is that, despite what I just said, I do think it's incredibly important to combine these different pieces of civil society when they're going to interact with security forces and with municipal and federal authorities. This has an incredible power if you have a wide array of groups. I think the best current example of this is probably the Monterey group, and I don't know whether or not you can scroll down and kind of look and see. There's a place where you can see all the different participants, and there's 20 or so participants, maybe a little bit less. But it's a huge array of business and human rights and church groups, and what we saw is that was one of the things that was most important. These groups have greater success if they have some experience. In other words, those who are sort of long-time participants in civil society obviously know how all of this works. What we found in some places also is that these groups don't necessarily have to have the wealthiest participants in order to be successful. In other words, in order to gain some sort of political capital, you might need wealthy people, but maybe not the most wealthy people, because what you find is the most wealthy leave. They don't stay anymore, because why would they? And so they leave in massive numbers too. I mean, we saw in Nuevo Laredo something in the range of 75% of the owners of the most important industry in that area had left. They were not there anymore. So it may not be the most wealthy, but certainly you do need, and you will fare better if you have some people who are of the elite. The second thing is that the existence of strong civil society groups and business associations is definitely a precondition for successful interaction between government and civil society. The civilian sector needs organized voices. And they need to have, this is a bit going back to the point made earlier, they need to have this sort of tradition. What we found, for example, in Tijuana was, one of the oldest business associations was really at the forefront of this connection between the military, the municipal government, and civil society folks. The third thing that I would mention is that there has to be political will from the highest levels, from the federal levels. This is often, and especially I would argue in the case of the PRI, incredibly important, mostly because the PRI has a much better sort of, they have a much more hierarchical structure, ability to sort of impose discipline on their members. So if you have buy-in from the federal level, what we have seen is that there is action on the local level. But it really almost always starts, unfortunately, with a federal voice coming down and demanding there to be action. And the fourth thing would be that the security forces members need to take an active role. Where we saw success, we saw security force members having regular interactions with civil society actors. Exchanging information both on a formal and an informal basis, developing a relationship that perhaps did not exist earlier. Okay, sorry about that. Finally, we need to have a very clear idea of what civil society's role is in this whole process. I think that there are tremendous expectations sometimes going in that they should control just about everything that is going on in the government, and really that's not the case. There needs to be limitations and understanding from the civil society's perspective as to what exactly they can and cannot push for. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. We'll now move to a presentation by Octavio Rodriguez. Octavio is a Mexican attorney and also the coordinator of the Justice in Mexico project at the University of San Diego.
Thank you very much, David. Thanks to the Wilson Center, the Mexico Institute, and of course, thanks to my team at the Justice in Mexico project in San Diego.
Do you have a presentation, Octavio?
I do have a presentation, yes. If you help me to put that. I'll start saying my chapter is a story of resilience. My chapter talks about judicial reform in Mexico that was passed in 2008, mainly by the pressure and the engagement of civil society. When I started to study this issue, I realized that this accomplishment was made mainly, as I mentioned, by engagement of civil society. Then I had to identify key actors who were the most important actors, civil society organizations that made this change possible. Then when I started to do my documental and my qualitative research, I came up with a group of 10 civil society organizations, and what was interesting of those, of that group is that rather than be grassroots organization, they were more high-level intellectual organizations, and we're talking about bar associations, research centers, and or networks of other smaller organizations. So I was mentioning, I came up with a list of 10 amongst the most important and most influential civil society organizations in Mexico that were very, very influential to the passing of the judicial reform. Renace was my first case study, civil society organization from Monterrey, who was responsible for the first reform at the national level, and that's reform in Nuevo León, which then opened the door for other reforms nationwide, Chihuahua, Zacatecas, Oaxaca, and others. My second civil society organization, it was Mexico SOS, an organization founded by a wealthy businessman, Alejandro Martí, who lost his son by organized crime. He was kidnapped and killed. And they've become very engaged in topics of victims, judicial reform, police, security, etc. My third organization is CIDAC, the Centro de Investigación para el Desarrollo in Mexico City. They're mostly a research center, and they develop a corpus of indicators of the judicial system in general in terms of security and justice. The National Network for Oral Trials, conocido como la Red, and other for Lawyers with Cameras, Abogados con Cámaras, the producers of the film Presumed Guilty or Presunto Culpable, the Mexican Bar Association, the National College of Lawyers, and the Association of National In-House Counsel Attorneys, private company attorneys. Then I developed a scale from 1 to 7 to measure the impact of each organization in the judicial reform and the process of discussing, approving, and implementing the reform in 4 different areas. One was policy and legislation. The second one was public education. The third one was analysis and evaluation. And the fourth was technical assistance. When I developed my research, then I came to grade each individual organization and came up with a visual image, an image of the impact they've had in the judicial reform. And for example, we see Renace. Renace has a very, very integral or comprehensive influence in each 4 components, whereas Mexico SOS is more towards policy legislation and public education. CIDAC, the research center, is more towards analysis and evaluation in public education, whereas the National Network for Oral Trials is more, I'm sorry. What up? Sorry. There you go. The National Network is more onto policy and public education. Then we go to Lawyers with Cameras, the producers of Presumed Guilty. They're more into public education, some analysis and evaluation, and they're very strong in their policy influence. The Mexican Bar Association was more into public education and analysis rather than policy influence and technical assistance, whereas the National College of Lawyers was more inclined to policy and legislation influence. And finally, the National Association of In-House Counsel Attorneys was balanced somehow between public education and policy and legislation. I'll let you guys read all the analysis of each organizations. I'm sorry. But what is important is to see the general picture. I finally came out with a snapshot of how this influence can be seen, and can be seen like this. Civil society organization has been more active and more influential in policy, legislation, and public education than in technical assistance or in analysis and evaluation. With that in mind, then I developed a series of policy recommendations and conclusions, which I will just refer to three of them. First, international aid and support has been very influential and positive in this process of implementing judicial reform. As you saw in the diagram, in this blank, in this space that Mexican civil societies haven't been very active, such as technical assistance, international organizations have been very active along with Mexican and US academic institutions. In my chapter, I don't talk about the work of universities and other academic institutions that have been very influential in the technical assistance component. The second one is talking also about international support. We've seen that international organizations have moved from a somehow aggressive approach at the beginning, and aggressive in a positive way, trying to push for a more proactive reform, proactive action from the Mexican government and the Mexicans in general, to a more informed, more sensitive, and more respectful of the culture and the sensitivities of Mexicans. And finally, we've seen a huge gap, big blank space in oversight and evaluation. And I think at this point is where Mexican government, along with academic institutions and other civil societies organizations, must really develop performance indicators, a system to evaluate the system, of course, to see how things are going, how the implementation processes are working, are they being effective. Now we're facing a new legislation. The Mexican government just passed a national criminal code, which will be applied to all states, and then they have to reform some of their systems to apply the new legislation. So it will be important to see how this system is going to work while when all the states are applying the same legislation and under the same guidelines. And well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Octavio. We'll finish up with a presentation by Dan Sabat, who's going to talk about police and civic engagement of police. He's currently a senior impact evaluation advisor with social impact and a visiting researcher at Georgetown University.
Hello, hello. Okay, great. Thank you very much, David. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today, and for it's a real honor to be included with this great group of folks here. So, what my piece was looking at, those of you who know me, I work more on police reform, and so I was really particularly interested in the role of citizens in interacting with their police. And what I do in this chapter is focus on two different roles or functions. One, which I call co-production, or what typically in Spanish is referred to as corresponsabilidad, is the role of citizens in actually co-producing the good of public security along with police. And the other that we'll see is very related is the role of citizens in oversight and overseeing their police forces. This is some data from the Guadalajara Justicia Barometro, who our very own David Shirk is kind of the main motivating force behind this. Is surveys with police officers and justice officials. We have a survey of over 5,000 Guadalajara police officers, and this is one of the most encouraging little slides that and bits of statistical information. Police were asked what is the most effective factor in combating crime, and you can see the plurality there, 45% say greater community participation, which is kind of really encouraging, because you would expect police to say we need more cars and we need more police, and that's in fact not what police are saying. They're saying, no, we need greater citizen support and greater citizen involvement, which is a really, really encouraging thing. So one of the things that I kind of focus in on, just mainly for argument's sake, there's different roles that citizens can play, but one is on reporting crime itself. And there's a lot of really good news in this area, and kind of I'm going to talk a little bit about the good news and also a little bit about the bad news. And the good news is that there's been really a dramatic transformation in the way that 911 calls, the equivalent of 911 calls, 066 in Mexico is done. I'm by no means an old timer, but when I started working on police stuff in Mexico in 2005, there was no unified 066 number. Every state municipality had different numbers, and it was a complete kind of mess. And so now you go into the call centers, and so the Baja California one, which I kind of focus in on the case of Baja California for a couple of reasons we'll see in a minute, really these modern facilities with all kinds of all the bells and whistles you could imagine, and really very impressive operations. That one in particular certified by the Commission for Accreditation of Law Enforcement Agencies, which is a pretty rigorous accreditation process. And in the course of one fiscal year, receiving close to 5 million calls and dealing with that with about a 32-second response time and getting it out to the appropriate first responder. So very impressive in that regard. Another really nice development since the mid-2000s is the 089 number, which is for anonymous reporting. There's still a lot of lack of confidence or trust in calling the 066 number, fear of organized crime, for example, infiltration into call centers, which is a reality. The 089 number was launched as a result of that, so people could make anonymous reporting. And they're just given a case number that they can then follow up with, again, anonymously. The last bullet there is from Baja California statistics from the same fiscal year, and so the state government was claiming 3,200 arrests as a result of calls to the anonymous phone line. Now, most of those are for minor things, but over 400 of them were for federal crimes, and they could also point to several cases where it was influential in addressing cases of secuestro, of kidnapping, and of human trafficking. And this is just some numbers. You can see the growth in the use of the 089 number in Baja California, pretty dramatic over a course of just a few years. And along with those kinds of innovations, you also have a lot of promotion and campaigns to say, hey, report crime. And the Tijuana 3D campaign, this was during the previous administration in Tijuana, the Bustamante administration, was a big, they were sending out text messages even of, hey, report crime if you see it. And they had this slogan, report it because the worst crime is staying quiet. Chamber of Commerce had a rather robust program of kind of identifying people who had to commercial robberies, not of local establishments, and kind of identifying those faces through closed circuit cameras, and then developing kind of most wanted lists and things like that. And there was a lot of collaboration there. The state government was promoting these citizen security networks, which are always kind of a mixed bag when the government's behind promoting it. They tend to either be used for partisan purposes or just neglected, and really they just want to have big numbers. So not a great story there, but the Citizen Council in Baja California was promoting neighborhood watch groups around the same time that were far more autonomous and very much model after the neighborhood watch process in the United States. So a lot of efforts there to increase crime reporting. But so some of the bad news, so if police are very receptive to the idea that they need citizen participation, they don't feel that they have it. So this is some data here from Ciudad Juarez and Guadalajara, both again from the Justicia Barometro. And when asked, does society cooperate with the police in preventing crimes? In Ciudad Juarez, this is 2011, so this is kind of the peak of violence in Ciudad Juarez. Most police, 71% saying no. But even in Guadalajara, which at the time was far more, in 2009 when this data was collected, far more peaceful place, again, 60% saying no. So a recognition of the need of citizen support, but not entirely convinced that they're getting it. And the statistic that's pointed to the most often is that only 12.8% of crimes are believed to be reported. This is estimated through victimization surveys, the INVIPE, which is a massive victimization survey of about 900,000. Yeah, not 900, 90,000, which is also insanely large. 90,000 households. When the other 88% were asked why they didn't report the crime, there's a whole variety of answers they can give, but about 63.7 of those were blaming the authorities, essentially. The authorities are corrupt, the authorities are ineffective, it takes too long, they don't get anything done. And the other the remainder of that are things like, it was kind of a small deal, it wasn't things that necessarily the authorities were to blame for, but a large percent blaming the authorities in a sense. And what you can see here is that also the Invipe asked people, well, how long, those that did report a crime, how long did it take you to do that? And this you have to take with a grain of salt because it's people recalling back into the past, and then who knows what exactly they're thinking. But the numbers are pretty concerning here. Less than 1 hour was less than 20%. About 23% say it took more than 4 hours to do my crime reporting. Well, that's a pretty long time, and that would be something that would discourage people from reporting crimes, particularly smaller things. And it's really a lot of times those smaller things that really matter. For police intelligence, if there's a whole lot of kind of small-scale crimes going on in one area, but none of those are reported, that means they're not showing up in crime statistics. That means the police are not taking that into account when they make their planning. And so there is kind of a civic need for people to be saying, hey, this was a small robbery, but it occurred. I want you to know about it. And if many people are doing that, then the police have a much better picture of what's going on. So those kinds of long delays can be very discouraging. I have up here 26%, which is the statistic of unreported crime in Baja California. So about so it's only, wait, did I say that backwards? No, 26% reported. So twice the percentage of crime is being reported in Baja California than in the rest of the country, or the national average anyway. And there's a lot of it has to do with those kinds of improvements that they've had on the institutional side, and also these promotional campaigns. Also, they've done some interesting innovations, like allowing legally the municipal police to receive crime reports. So some interesting things there. And the kind of the bottom line is that reporting can be increased, and it can be increased through things that we know about by improving the institutions that receive those crimes, 066 and 089 dispatching centers, these awareness raising efforts, making it easier to report crimes. Also, I kind of talk a little bit about insurance penetration. Many people in the States report crimes because you need it for your insurance. Only 6.7% of crime reporters in Mexico also filed an insurance claim. So if you see insurance going up, you'll also see crime reporting going up, which is an important little caveat there. But one of the big obstacles is reduction of corruption and improving trust in the police. And this is just kind of this is cross-national data here. The y-axis is average confidence in the police. Each one of these little plots is a country in the Western Hemisphere. And along the x-axis there is the percent of people who reported that they've had a bribe solicited. This is from the Latin American Public Opinion Project, the Americas Barometer. And as you can see, there's this very clear negative relationship between these two, and this red dot at the end with the highest percent of people that have reported that a police officer solicited a bribe from them would be, any guesses? Yeah, that's Mexico. So clearly that perception of corruption or reality of corruption, along with a lack of confidence in the police, is one of the key drivers that discourages people from reporting crimes. And so this leads into the next concern that I kind of focus on in the paper, which is about accountability mechanisms. And there's two kind of broad things that I look at in the piece. The first is citizen public security councils, which have been around since 1995. Legislation was passed that kind of created the possibility of these councils. And they've been around for a long time. And basically the bottom line conclusion is these are not tools for accountability. The only really great example that has been a consistent tool of accountability is in Baja California, the State Citizen Council, which has done a whole bunch of things that I talked briefly about in the article. But when you look kind of throughout the country, you don't find a whole lot of these councils really doing much in terms of accountability. Now, after the 2008 national agreement was signed, there was this push to create observatories. And this was pulling from this epidemiological approach that says if we want to see if our policies and practices are working, we need to have really reliable statistics and indicators about crime so that we can see if crimes are going down, if the situation's getting better and whatnot. And so this was borrowed from other Latin American experiences, particularly Colombia, where these observatories were considered key to the transformation that occurred in those countries. And so to create a source of reliable data at the local level, to avoid, and really at the local level is kind of the focus here. We've had good national statistics at the national level, but it's at the local level where the information can really inform police actions and civil society actions and inform policy. So having that good kind of micro data at the local level is what you need. And the reality is that we've had at the local level has been very cherry-picked information, where the municipal administration will pick the statistics they think make them look the best and put those in their annual reports. And so having a non-biased citizen group that's kind of overseeing this process of data collection and data analysis and data presentation to the public could be a really nice backdoor into achieving accountability. But in creating these, you kind of have two broad debates. One was, how much should these observatories engage with the government and cooperate with the government, which was the model that was used in Colombia, which was the model in the citizen security councils, and how much should they be autonomous? And the other big debate was, should they just be gathering information and making it available, or should they really be leading policy debates as well? In the article, I profiled two at the national level and also one in Ciudad Juarez, although there are others. The basic story here is kind of something similar to the citizen councils in a lot of ways. It's that this is something that has enormous potential, and there are several successful case studies that we can point to of really impressive actions by these civil society actors, and yet we haven't seen this scaled up or really existing on a large scale. There are some great success stories, but it's not a success story nationwide. And so the National Observatory is kind of emblematic of this. They were started, at least in theory, in 2008, kind of officially in 2009, and they didn't release their first report until 2011. I was doing interviews about this in 2009, and everybody was really excited, and wow, we're doing this, and it's going to be amazing. And then, 2 years later, nothing had really happened, and there was a lot of kind of disputes about who would do what. There was a lot of conflict with the federal government at that time that was in the view of many civil society organizations trying to co-opt the effort. And anyway, things got that slowed down. And so they ended up choosing to be fully autonomous and unrelated to the national government. At the local level, I profile one in Ciudad Juarez, and here is a very different model, working very closely with the government and really trying to intervene in the policy process. So, for example, probably their biggest success story was they did a big profile of traffic deaths, actually, which is not what you'd think in Ciudad Juarez, but they picked something. They also did the violent crime stuff, but the traffic one was in many ways more interesting, because then they pushed forward a national or a citywide policy on how to deal and address traffic deaths, and that led to some actual changes. So kind of an interesting case there. But I'm out of time here. So anyway, lots of cool stuff online too, and that's a nice thing with all the internet technology and the GPS mapping. This is from Puebla, the kind of very cool maps that you can now see. We go online, just like what we have in DC, and now you have that in many Mexican municipalities where you can get online and see what crimes have occurred in my neighborhood. And so there are these case studies that we can point to. But the basic conclusions is that reporting has improved dramatically, and we know how to further improve it, which is really good, but we still have some fundamental obstacles, mainly this kind of lack of trust and confidence and corruption. And then we have several impressive citizen observatories, but they're not yet scaled up or necessarily sustainable. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Dan. And I think the only thing that, aside from resilient communities, that the authors really, I think, appreciate is resilient audiences. And you have lived through 6 presentations back to back. So if you want to take a quick break to stretch, do some yoga, Pilates, whatever you need, please do. But I'd like to jump right into questions, discussion, and get your thoughts on some of the presentations, questions, so that we can hear from all of you.
Could you please introduce yourself? There's a microphone coming.
Hey, Lane.
Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Lynn Hammergren, sort of a consultant, have worked with a lot of agencies. I have two questions. One for Stephen Dudley. In that very interesting presentation, I still couldn't figure out what civil society organizations do in this. Are they calling attention to the problem and demanding response? Or are they doing something like working with juveniles at risk and things like that? And for Octavio, I'm very interested in the role of the CSOs in the criminal justice reform. My understanding was that their first interest was really in due process rights, and so they weren't really interested in the citizen security part. And Luis Pásara's article that was just published in a Wilson Center book, in fact, said he wasn't looking at Mexico, that the criminal justice reforms haven't done much for citizen security. Mm-hmm. But the second question, or the question that sort of follows from that, and I will editorialize, I think the Código Único was a terrible idea, and David knows that. But who was behind that? And can you explain why someone 5 years into the process suddenly decides, whoops, that's fine that you passed your laws, but now we're going to pass one for you? When I first heard it, I thought it was sabotage, but I understand it actually someone thought it was going to work better. So.
Great. Please, Steve. Steve, why don't you go? Actually, we'll facilitate a couple of questions just so we can get more people, if that's all right. Sure. Please.
Hi, my name is Emma Grajev, and although I live here, my family is from Jalapa. And as Emily mentioned, you know, the people who are dying now are left, right, and center in Jalapa are not only journalists, but people who have been involved with the journalists as well. Family, friends, and everybody. Now, there is a lot of involvement for what I see because I'm in touch with all my friends there. There are a lot of bikers now, right? And they spread the news about what's going on. This is happening in this area. You know, take a look, find out what it is, report. There's a lot of involvement. Now, the governor belongs to the same party as the president, and yet when it comes to security, although they have to have all the federal assistance, there's nothing there. All what is reported doesn't bring any response from the government. There were days where there was no police in the city in Jalapa, no police at all. There were days when the governor was not in the city. He was living in, I don't know, Cordoba or Orizaba, somewhere else. You know, I mean, because he himself found the city very, very dangerous. So it's more than that. It's more than that. There is community involvement. There is collaboration between the federal and the state, and yet it's still becoming a failed society. Any comments on that? Why?
Let's take one more from Ted up here, and then we'll have a couple of responses. We can probably have time for one more round of questions after this, so get ready.
I have a very simple question. It's really impressive to see both the breadth and the depth of research that's gone into this study, and it brings to light a lot of aspects that I never even thought of. But I'm interested to see the problem has shifted at least a little bit from the border cities to, I mean, the most acute problem now is obviously Michoacan. Mm-hmm. I'd be interested in how the panelists feel that their conclusions relate or might be modified by what seems to be happening in Michoacan today.
Yeah, great question. Why don't we give everyone a chance to go in reverse order, just down, if you want to comment, start with Dan and work our way back across and give time for people to formulate the next round of questions. Anything you feel like I mean, police in Michoacan, famous photo in the last few weeks of a police officer being held at gunpoint by citizens in Michoacan. I mean, anything.
That's accountability.
That's accountability for you.
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, accountability, it does end up meaning a lot of things. I guess I would just, I mean, this was more for Stephen, but I would just comment on the role of civil society organizations, that you do see very diverse roles and very diverse actions. And you can probably put those into different buckets or different categories of things. A lot of the ones that I had looked at are some activities are oriented towards accountability, but a lot are oriented towards other things. And so you have groups that I would lump in that co-production group. So those are kind of your neighborhood watch groups. Those are the DARE or .A organizations, and kind of the ones running after school programs for kids. And so it's kind of far more service-oriented things that we think about NGOs doing very well, which is providing some kind of good or service, rather than necessarily the advocacy and kinds of actions and behaviors that operate. Tends to be very different groups doing those different kinds of things. A lot of the things that groups are doing also is kind of support for the police in a lot of ways that I found kind of interesting and surprising. So the Chamber of Commerce sponsoring kind of awards, police recognition awards, providing discounts at restaurants, things that you wouldn't necessarily expect. There were a group of builders, for example, got together and put, this was in Mexicali, and they pooled their resources to say this house will be lotteried off to a police officer. I mean, so there's a whole range of different actions that really span a wide spectrum of, and that's kind of the beauty of civil society. I mean, this 1,000 points of light idea is that there's many things that need to be done, and while government policy might focus in one place or another, that civil society groups can say, hey, this isn't being done, or this is clearly a need, and so let's fill the gap. And so we can point to a lot of really good examples of where that's been happening in these large cities. Now, when you translate that into a place like Michoacan, or more rural communities where that kind of capacity isn't necessarily there, or that civil society doesn't necessarily exist, I suspect that I did some civil society work in Nuevo Laredo long before the violence got really bad, and their civil society was very, very weak compared to everywhere else in the north. And so it's not entirely surprising to me that you find that this, what was always a very co-opted and very weak civil society, is not able to respond to this challenge. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Octavio.
Thanks. So if I understood correctly, the first question was, what's the actual role, or what was the actual role of CSOs in the process? As I mentioned,
In regard to the question I asked
Mhm.
you, because that was really for Stephen, I guess it would be, what were they promoting in the first part, and then were they involved in coding?
well, mostly, as I mentioned, Renace, this organization in Monterrey, was actually the mother or the father of reforms nationwide. They basically were pursuing a more due process, respectful system. And first that happened in Monterrey, and then at the national level, Renace and its founder Ernesto Canales created the National Network on Oral Trials, that it's basically Renace on steroids kind of thing, just in the policy arena, because they were basically the ones who pressured politicians. They sat at the table with them and told them, this is what you have to do. We have to change things. The rate of impunity is ridiculous. It's more than 92% people go unpunished in Mexico. There was a need of doing something. So I see that mostly it was towards due process on the first part. The second part, why a Código Único? Was that a sabotage by the Federation? I think it can be perceived as sabotage for a group of states that were there were leaders in the judicial reform. We're talking about Chihuahua, Morelos, Baja California, but it was pure oxygen for others that were close to the deadline of 2016 to apply the new judicial system, and they really didn't do much progress. That's on the one hand. On the second hand, probably the Federation showed some lack of leadership during this process. there was mostly state level efforts that really made this reform possible. And probably like that's a sign of the Federation to really engage in this process and help some states to really get to speed in order to meet the 2016 deadline. Whether that was the right way to do it or not, we'll see. And third, we
made it optional for the states who didn't have a code.
correct, and that leads to my third point, which is I see this as a larger policy of centralization by the new administration, and it's just not judicial reform; it's security, it's economics, it's more. So I think we shouldn't consider this as an isolated topic. We should consider it in a broader context. Thanks.
Just real quick, what do organizations do? I think it's a great question, and I apologize to everyone for not laying this out earlier. I mean, I think there's a progression, what we've seen. They start with public displays of dissatisfaction. I mean, there's everything from speaking out in public to organizing marches and things of that sort, and then following the incident in Juarez, for example, it was basically one of the mothers who told the president, you're out welcome here. Those sorts of things end up being catalysts for what happens next, which are often, what we would call working groups. What in Juarez they called mesas, in other places they named them different things. But creating formal mechanisms of exchange and meeting places. And then hopefully those meeting places then lead to these informal and formal interactions, which lead to direct action. Which lead to sort of the creation of perhaps even more, political capital for the security forces. Perhaps a direct action would be getting everybody to have a license plate in Juarez. And then an informal action would be all of a sudden I have a direct connection to people who are dealing with things such as extortion or kidnapping. And I can call them directly, right to their telephone. I don't have to go through anybody else. So all of a sudden you find these informal types of interactions, which also have an impact in reducing these criminal activities, and especially these very sensitive, dealing with sensitive information, dealing with things such as extortion, dealing with things such as kidnapping. So you have all these different, plus what Daniel laid out beautifully, this sort of 1,000 points of light. You can kind of hit from all different angles, from advertisements to direct action to political action to political force, or saying we're going to pull back our support for you, be it campaign finances or actual political support. So there's a lot of different ways in which civil society can interact with their government forces. And then just with regards to Michoacan, I suppose one of the lessons we take away from this was this sort of absolute desperation to reach the point where you have to become armed means you don't have any sort of effective civil society groups operating in these territories, and that our efforts are so geared towards creating or enforcing or strengthening existing government institutions. That's why I think this project was so great, and to a certain extent I'm sorry that Pillar 4 wasn't Pillar 1, that you need to create in a parallel track these types of programs that strengthen civil society institutions, because they are just as important as strengthening the governmental institutions. Thanks.
On the question of Jalapa and I guess Veracruz more generally, I mean, I think it's interesting because the Peña Nieto administration made it very clear even before coming into office that he really did not want to deal with the security issues, right, in the same sort of public way that the Calderon administration had, and even with regard to sort of the media, and this was, I think, again before he took office, that he said that he wanted the media to achieve a balance, right, between good and bad news, and he did not want to sort of have all this negative attention on Mexico, and I think. He was forced to deal with Michoacan, right? I mean, with the Templarios and everything that was sort of going on. He has not yet been forced to deal with Tamaulipas, right? Which is arguably even worse than what's going on, right? In Michoacan. Veracruz, you know, it's sort of interesting. I was thinking about this when I saw Matt's map, that if you look at sort of these spatially where the violence is happening, and unlike sort of even with the map that I had, that where the violence against journalists sort of peaks, where the violence is against everybody else is also peaking, right? That isn't so much the case in Jalapa, right? We haven't seen the same kind of explosion in violence on the scale that we did, for example, in Juarez. But yet we've got this sort of mini explosion of sort of violence against journalists, right? And it suggests that there's maybe some very interesting things kind of going on there. It could be that part of what's going on is that the violence against journalists is more linked to sort of crime and corruption more generally, right, and not as much to the drug trafficking organizations. But either way, the example that you gave is really a disturbing one, right? That, I mean, there's this sort of this absence, and looks like Veracruz, on the surface, that it's sort of going more the way of Tamaulipas, right, than it is the way of Michoacan. And I think it's going to be very, I don't have the answers, right? But I agree with you that there are some very worrying signs about that region.
The thing is, a lot of the crime is not reported anymore.
That's right.
I see my friends posting, so many people have. I see so many people posting that there's a lot of kidnapping, especially from young girls, that's going on. And you know that because you are in any of those, web cycles where you can read it. But you're not going to read it in the newspaper because people are not reporting.
That's right. No, that's right. And those people that are reporting, right, that are sort of functioning as journalists, then themselves become very vulnerable, right? Because they don't have any sort of infrastructure around them that then can protect them.
That's
right?
Correct. And the government comes out saying nothing is happening in Veracruz.
And has gone to great lengths, right? For example, with the murder of Regina, I'm forgetting her name, or Martinez, right, from Proceso, right? That the whole story that came out about, that her murder was the result of a break-in, and all of these types of stories that came out, and then the supposed confessions. I mean, there were all kinds of sort of very strange elements that very clearly implicated the government in a cover-up, right?
And the last one, where the man was found so far away
That's
from
right.
Veracruz.
That's right.
Matt?
Yeah, great questions, and I'd like to respond to all of them, but I'm going to stick just to the last one about Michoacan, and adhere very closely to the core findings of my chapter. I think it's tempting to think about something that we could do quickly to undo what's happening in Michoacan, or neutralize vigilante groups, self-defense groups. What is some kind of quick fix that we could come to? So can we tinker with some existing institutions? Can we promote some new partnership among NGOs or civil society to undo this? And I think inherent in our discussion of building community resilience must be, especially if we're talking about policy changes, some recognition that this is going to take a long time. And relatedly, that what's been happening in Michoacan and in other parts of Mexico has been building for a long time. Right? The self-defense groups that exist in Michoacan didn't appear overnight. Right? There are similar analogous groups in other parts of Mexico, in Guerrero, for instance. And I'm not saying that we should dispense with police reform or criminal procedure reform. We should proceed on all available fronts. But while we're tinkering with institutions and improving partnerships among NGOs and civil society, we should also be altering the structural foundations of violence, right? So improving educational conditions so that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, we're not talking about the next Michoacan, right? Or the next Tamaulipas. If we can start, the sooner we can start altering the sort of structural foundations of violence, improving local education and regional economic development, then we're going to decrease the chances of seeing another Michoacan 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now.
Let's take another round of questions, but I'm going to
say one thing.
please.
The last two questions, I think, I mean, they fit together very, very nicely because they point at something which comes out quite clearly when you look at all of these chapters together, which is that having a strong civil society isn't enough. You need to have strong institutions at the level of the state or the federal government that respond to those. And that's a crucial lesson from here. It's all well and good that you have an active civil society, but who listens? And by the same token, you know, if you look at the case of Michoacan, for example, you have a society that's organized itself there in a particular way because it didn't have any other possibilities, any other outlets. So it's organized itself, it's armed itself, and it's reacting, protecting itself in that way. In other states where there have been other kinds of outlets, more positive outlets, and the government has responded, you've seen a much more positive response. In the case of Veracruz, you see that there's frustration, desperation, and you wonder how that's going to play out in the long term. Is it going to be more like Michoacan? Is it going to be more like Tamaulipas, where you see a complete breakdown of trust in society? And that's one of the things that we're trying to emphasize, I think, through this book, is that you need to strengthen civil society, you need to strengthen government, because otherwise you don't have a counterpart, and you need to establish trust and confidence between those two sides so they actually talk to each other. And there's a deficit of trust on both sides, which comes out quite clearly in these chapters.
Let's take another round of questions, and I'm going to be very strict with the authors this time to make sure that they give you only a 2-minute response. Please, right here.
I'm Xenia Wilkinson. I worked in Mexico City at the American Embassy for 6 years, and now I'm a Latin America scholar. All of you touched on this subject a bit, but I wondered if you could share with us your analysis of, or comparison between the relations of civil society and the federal government under Peña Nieto and under Cardenas, and how has that evolved under the new administration?
Calderon.
I'm back in.
I don't remember back that far. But,
I apologize. I'm back in ancient history.
I want to live in that world.
Another question up front here.
Hi, thank you all very much. I actually work mainly in citizen security and violence prevention in Central America, a little bit in Mexico, for a USAID contractor for Chemonics International. And I'm wondering, and I appreciate so much all your comments, and especially the concrete policy recommendations. I was wondering, not so much on the federal level or even civil society, but particularly on the local or municipal level. I think this relates mainly to Daniel and Steve, but what are the steps that can be taken to rebuild trust on a municipal level, despite what may or may not be happening on a federal level, between police and citizens? And in places, how you were mentioning, like in Nuevo Laredo, where any semblance of a strong civil society either never existed or has been obliterated, then how do you begin to repair that?
Great. One more in the back. Please.
Yeah, I'm Larry Heilman. I'm in the anthropology department over at the Smithsonian and have been working on democracy and governance programs for about 20 years. My question, obviously I haven't had a chance to read the report. I've just heard what you've said. But my question is this. If each of you had to go before the present president, looking at your area of concern, do you have the kind of performance indicators in place to be able to say to the current administration in Mexico, this is where we are in terms of performance with regards to whatever institution or community you're looking at? And could you make a report to give him a thumbnail sketch of progress or lack of progress?
Great question. All right, this time we'll go this way across the table, and now I'm timing you. So, Matt, you have 2 minutes.
I'll keep it really brief, even though it wasn't directed at me. The second question about how to rebuild trust, returning to the issues of education and economics, I would say it's very difficult to rebuild trust in some kind of formal sense of building public confidence, optimism, where there are deeply entrenched, persistent lack of opportunities. So where there are no educational opportunities or low educational opportunities or persistently low economic opportunities, it's very difficult to build trust in some broader sense, right? Or faith in the system, so to speak. So I think building trust is more than kind of an exercise in bringing people together and kind of social capital improvements or social capital building exercises. I think it's structural. It has a kind of macro component.
Great, thanks. Emily?
Do I get his time?
You get
I'm just
an
kidding.
extra.
No.
I donated.
You got 2 minutes.
Just very briefly to respond to the difference in administrations, I think. I think on one level there is no difference between the Calderon administration and the Peña administration so far, at least with regard to violence against journalists. I mean, I think Calderon, over the course of his sexenio, was forced to deal with it, I mean, and this really does speak to, I think, the strength of civil society and their ability to put the issue on the table and really sort of demand a response, even though that response was unsatisfactory in many ways. And I think in a way, you know, Peña saw that and tried to establish the rules very clearly on, which is to say, look, you know, and even there was a lot of this during the Calderon administration, which sort of was this implication that journalists were bringing this sort of mistreatment on themselves for asking too many questions and you know, sort of trying to expose delicate information and these types of things. You know, we haven't seen, with the exception perhaps of the last case in Veracruz of the journalist who was murdered and, you know, found with his, you know, body parts in different places and this type of thing. You know, I mean, the good news in the aggregate is that there's only been one that we can sort of document for sure, sort of journalist death in Mexico so far this year, which is good, right? I mean, now Brazil, if you just look at this year alone and the last, 11 months, Brazil is actually worse than Mexico. But the bad news then, as sort of an issue, kind of recurring issue that's come up a couple of times, is that, you know, as that violence, as that sort of really in-your-face violence begins to dissipate, the pressure lessens, right? And then that becomes the pressure on the administration lessens, and the problem, it's harder to get the momentum behind it to then create the foundations that you need to prevent it from happening again, right? And I think that's kind of a recurring theme that we see with a lot of these different topics, is that you know, there needs to be, in a way, the space to really create change has to come. Well, it comes out of crisis, but you need the crisis to dissipate to have the time and the space to make those changes, so that you prevent the next crisis, right? But then once the crisis is lessened, the momentum, right, to change it goes away too, right? So it's this kind of catch-22 sort of situation.
All right, Stephen.
I would just say, just on the trust question, trust is definitely, I like the idea of it being structural, but what we found, at least in our look at this, and I've looked at it through another project through American University, trust between Mexican security forces and U.S. security forces, and what we found is trust is actually personal, very personal, and trust is built through different types of channels, and I would say some of those channels are formal. You can formalize these channels, and you can make them regular, which they've done, I think, in places that have built or rebuilt successful trusting relationships. And then these often lead to these informal channels, or you can create informal means. In a situation, there was a case in which U.S. law enforcement, mid to low-level guys, invited the sort of attorney general's guys over to watch a football game and, you know, have a barbecue and that sort of thing, and that's how they started to have a relationship. So those are two different ways you can do it. And then within the structural confines that you create, whether they're working groups or not, I think that you have to create common goals, and everybody has to be on the same page with those goals. And as long as you have a police that has a different goal, whether it not be involved with organized crime because they're too afraid, or be involved because they want to protect somebody in organized crime, then you're never going to build that trust until you create the shared goal amongst the institutional side and then obviously civil society side. Then you're gonna have problems.
Great, thanks. Octavio, 2 minutes.
Thanks. I'm going to take your question about performance indicators. And we actually have performance indicators, at least in our field. We develop, which I believe is the largest survey of justice system operators in Mexico, independent at least. We surveyed public defenders, judges, and prosecutors from 9 different states in 2011. That led us to, that sat us in the table with the Mexican government at some point to develop the national survey on the new judicial system. My feeling, and we were able to incorporate some of these indicators in the national survey. My feeling after that is that the Mexican government included us in the discussion because they had to do it, because they had outside funding, but they weren't really open to incorporate our input. And we actually developed a report that we can present to anyone with some general indicators. I'm not saying that we have what it has to be done, but at least there are a lot of institutions, a lot of people doing interesting stuff, and I think the best recommendation that I could give is sit everyone at the table and start to talk.
So essentially the answer is no to the president. you really can't see performance.
There's two. I would say, there are two. And he's got 30 seconds. I'm going to steal 30 of them. There's two types of measures. There are outcome measures, and there are performance measures. And we actually have plenty of outcome measures, and they're all bad, right? I mean, we can look at homicide statistics. We can look at victimization rates. We can look at the real. There's a plethora of outcome measures, and they all are pretty consistent, public opinion polls, et cetera. But finding good performance measures is really the most difficult thing to do for, I think, any organization. And so, as Octavio mentioned, one of the things that we've tried to do, at least, there are a number of different ways of doing this. Qualitatively and quantitatively, but the surveys of judicial system actors to find out what they know, what their perception is of how the organization works, et cetera. Those are very good. They're snapshots of what's happening in an organization at a given point in time. What we haven't been able to do, because we've been waiting for time to pass, is to take another snapshot. And then you can see organizational change or lack of change. Right. No, those kinds of indicators, those kinds of internal indicators are not generated for the most part. And even when you look at other judicial system clearance rates, I mean, we have homicide statistics clearance rates, and what they show is that the vast majority of homicide cases that go into police and agencies and to prosecutors in Mexico are not resolved. Something like 80%. Of those cases are not resolved. So I would say there are performance measures. The problem is they're abysmal, and the solutions that are offered, I'm way into a minute and a half. The solutions, unfortunately, don't focus on process. They focus on purging police agencies and bringing in new elements with the same bad processes or the same. They pour out the wine and they put new wine into the bad barrel, and that I think is one of any substantive police reform or judicial sector reform in Mexico needs to really focus on creating the mechanisms, internal mechanisms for accountability within the agency or within the system that will actually raise performance. It's ultimately, I think, all about accountability, but I'm now like bad moderator. Go ahead.
Well, I'll pick up on that one. I think what a lot of it points to is what it's not just having indicators; it's having the right indicators, and particularly if we're talking about involvement, what kind of indicators would you use to look at involvement of citizens or things like that? Then it gets really kind of difficult. I mean, you could certainly look at all cities that receive Subsumun, the municipal subsidy, in theory are supposed to have a citizen observatory. So you could easily do a binary, yes, they have it, or no, they didn't have it. And that arguably at this point would be a very good thing because the vast majority do not have it. Now, later on down the road, you'll get to a point if you required that where everybody would say, yes, we have it, okay, but then the reality would be that it wouldn't be very good, or are they doing anything? And so then you kind of need a second generation of indicators to kind of get at those things. And this is one of the problems where when there is a tendency, whenever we can measure something, that's great, but it also creates the tendency to kind of window dressing kind of reforms where we want people checking off boxes rather than actually doing things well. And so there's that kind of fine balance that one has to draw. Now, I do impact and performance evaluation for a living, so I'm very sympathetic to measuring things and want to do that, but we have to do it with kind of eyes wide open. The how to build trust issue is a great one, and there's a real paradox here. As Stephen pointed out, it is personal trust. And so if you're talking about building trust among the population as a whole, that's one very complicated thing. If you're talking about building trust among kind of organized civil society, that's very easy to do. You have a mayor who's into working with civil society, and you have civil society groups that want to address public security, and they come together and they marry, and everything, and amazing things gets done. And we can point to lots of cases where that has happened. The problem, as Stephen pointed out, is that the administration leaves, somebody else comes in, and that all that work that was done is lost. And where you really see the good kind of examples of cooperation between communities or civil society groups and between the police, or when it doesn't have anything to do with the administration, and it tends to be more operational things. And so you can point to some really good examples of gender-based violence NGOs working with police departments, not at that high level, but at that mid-level. You can point to good examples of, I'm not a huge advocate of the DARE program, but they've done a very wonderful job of kind of embedding themselves within the police itself, and not the higher level command and the police chief and the police and the municipal president. And so how the way that trust gets rebuilt, because trust inevitably ends up being personal, is you keep the same people around. And if you're keeping the same people around, then the way you build trust between the police and citizens is having not decentralizing the police, but strengthening the institution of the police such that it is not so dependent on whoever the police chief and the municipal president is at that one time in office. So there's a real paradox there, because you can get, and development projects really have a tendency to kind of get this wrong because we have to show short-term results, and so it is a lot easier to go, well, we got a champion, and we got people here, and let's make them work, and we show some fabulous results that are completely unsustainable. And so that's a real kind of challenge in wrestling with that, because we do have to be thinking kind of long-term. For widespread building trust, that's a whole other topic, and if David gave me more time, I'd talk more about it, but
Nope, not going to happen. So, I think the major lesson of this book is that civil society matters, and that there are some bright spots in Mexico where civil society has begun to play an important role in helping to sort of reweave the social fabric after problems or in the face of problems of crime and violence. And the other important lesson is that government needs to be there to help. The Mexican state has its own problems and dysfunctions, and needs to address those and able to be an effective partner to Mexican civil society. But there are some encouraging signs, some useful possible lessons from some of the examples. And I'll just end by saying, I have a 3-year-old. Matt just actually, I have to say, has a 6-week-old, and he's here in Washington, D.C. So we want to say thank you to his wife and to Odin Ingram, his 6-week-old. I have a 3-year-old, and that means that my wife and I have been on exactly 3 dates in the last 3 years. And one of those dates was to go down to Tijuana one evening and have dinner. And you had, at one point, we're driving through the city, and it's like 9, 10 o'clock at night, and you see 200-300 people just emerge out of nowhere on bicycles in the middle of the night in Tijuana, riding around the city, sort of reclaiming the night. And this has happened I've seen this not just in Tijuana, but in a couple of other places in Mexico. And these kinds of things, I think, are really encouraging signs that Mexican civil society is there, and whether or not they're represented by formal organizations or by just sort of going out with their friends and finding ways to have a positive impact. Mexicans are proving that they can be resilient in the face of some of the really terrible crime and violence that we've seen, and what we can only hope for is that we can continue to encourage more of that. So thank you guys so much, and maybe a few more dates would be nice too. Thank you very much.